St. Mary's Catholic Church, in Cedar Falls, Iowa, had never felt smaller than it did on that gray October morning. The same wooden pews where I'd fidgeted through countless Sunday masses as a child now held 200 mourners, all there to pay their respects to my father, Thomas McKenna. Dad had been the town's beloved hardware store owner for 37 years. A pillar of the community who'd helped build half the houses in Cedar Falls and fixed the other half. Everyone knew Tom McKenna, the man who'd stay late to help a struggling family fix their furnace, who'd quietly forgive debts during hard times, who'd never missed a Sunday service in his life. Father Sullivan stood at the pulpit, his silver hair catching the light from the stained glass windows as he delivered the eulogy. He spoke about Dad's generosity, his devotion to the church, his role as a loving husband and father. All true, but something about the priest's tone felt rehearsed, careful. Thomas McKenna was a man of unwavering faith, Father Sullivan intoned, who lived his life according to God's will and the teachings of our Holy Mother Church. I shifted uncomfortably in the front pew, my mother's hand finding mine as she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My sister Kate sat on her other side, her husband Jim holding their sleeping daughter. That's when Father Sullivan made the mistake that changed everything. In his final days, Thomas found peace in the sacrament of confession, unburdening his soul before meeting his Maker. As is proper and sacred, those words remained sealed between a man and his God, never to be revealed. My jaw clenched. Never to be revealed. I thought about the manila envelope in my jacket pocket, the one I'd found in Dad's desk 3 days ago while sorting through his papers. The envelope marked for David only in his careful handwriting. Inside had been a letter, a confession, but not the kind Father Sullivan was talking about. This was a confession meant for the living, not the dead. A confession that revealed 30 years of lies, corruption, and cover-ups that went straight to the heart of this very church. Father Sullivan continued his sanitized version of my father's life, carefully omitting any mention of the money, the missing building fund donations, the altered books, the threats. Thomas McKenna lived without scandal, died without shame, and now rests in the eternal peace of the righteous. That's when I stood up. The church fell silent except for the whisper of fabric as 200 heads turned toward me. Mom tugged at my sleeve, whispering, "David, what are you doing?" I cleared my throat. "Father Sullivan, I'd like to say a few words about my father." The priest's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "David, this is ... irregular. We haven't prepared remarks from family members. I think people should hear from someone who knew the real Thomas McKenna. The family's grief is understood, but this is not your place to speak during the service proper. Perhaps afterward. This is not your place to speak," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the church, "but I think it is mine." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope. Father Sullivan's face went pale as he recognized Dad's handwriting on the front. My father left me something before he died. A final confession, you might say. And unlike some confessions, this one was meant to be shared. I opened the envelope with shaking hands as murmurs rippled through the congregation. Mom was staring at me with wide, frightened eyes, while Kate looked confused and alarmed. "David," Father Sullivan said, his voice sharp with authority, "I must insist that you return to your seat. This is neither the time nor the place." "When is the time, Father?" I interrupted. "When is the right time to tell the truth about a man's life, after everyone who loved him is dead? After the people he tried to protect have suffered for years in silence?" I unfolded the letter, written in Dad's familiar handwriting, the ink slightly smudged as if tears had fallen on it. "This is from my father, dated 1 week before his death." I began to read, "To my son David, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and it's time for the truth to come out. I can't carry these secrets to my grave, but I was too much of a coward to speak them while I lived." The church was dead silent now. Even Father Sullivan had stopped trying to interrupt, though his face had gone from pale to gray. For 30 years, I kept the books for St. Mary's Building Fund. For 30 years, I watched Father Sullivan take money meant for church improvements and use it for his own purposes. The new roof we supposedly couldn't afford. We could afford it 10 times over. The heating system that broke the budget. The money was there. Gasps echoed through the church. Mrs. Peterson, who'd donated her late husband's life insurance to the building fund, looked like she might faint. I have records of every transaction, every forged signature, every altered deposit slip. I kept them as insurance, but also as evidence of my own cowardice. I was complicit because I was afraid of losing my business, afraid of the scandal, afraid of standing up to a man who held so much power in this community. I looked up at Father Sullivan, who was gripping the pulpit so tightly his knuckles were white. The worst part, I continued reading, was watching families struggle to pay for church repairs that had already been paid for 3 times over. The Hendersons took out a second mortgage to donate to the roof fund. The Martins skipped family vacations for 5 years to contribute to the heating system, all while Father Sullivan used their donations to pay for his retreats to Las Vegas and his real estate investments in Florida. The murmurs had grown to angry voices. People were standing, looking between me and Father Sullivan with expressions of shock and betrayal. "David," Father Sullivan finally managed, "your father was unwell in his final days. The medications, the pain. Were you unwell 30 years ago, Father?" I asked, pulling out a photocopied bank statement. "Because this shows a deposit of $50,000 into your personal account, the same week the building fund received a major donation from the Peterson family." Mr. Johnson, the bank president, was staring at the document with professional recognition. That looks like a genuine bank record." "It is genuine," I said. "My father kept copies of everything. Bank statements, forged receipts, photographs of documents, 30 years of evidence that Father Sullivan has been stealing from this congregation." I held up a thick folder. "It's all here. Every theft, every lie, every family that sacrificed for repairs that were never needed because the money was already stolen." The church erupted in chaos. People were shouting, demanding answers, turning to each other with expressions of betrayal and rage. Through it all, Father Sullivan stood frozen at the pulpit, his face a mask of terror and guilt. Mom had gone pale, but she squeezed my hand. "Is this true, David?" "All of it. Every word." Mom, Dad, documented everything. "He was planning to turn it over to the police, but he got sick before he could act on it." Kate leaned across Mom. "Why didn't he tell us?" "Because he was ashamed. Because he thought staying silent protected us, protected his reputation. But in the end, he realized that protecting Father Sullivan meant betraying everyone else." I looked back at Father Sullivan, who seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "The letter ends with an apology," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "An apology to every family who sacrificed for this church while their donations lined your pockets, and a request that I finish what he was too scared to start." I folded the letter and looked directly at the priest. "Father Sullivan, my father's final confession wasn't to God, it was to the people you both betrayed. And unlike the confessions you hide behind, this one demands action." The chaos in the church was unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever seen. 30 years of suppressed doubts and ignored warning signs suddenly made sense as families realized they'd been systematically robbed by the man they'd trusted with their spiritual guidance. Father Sullivan finally found his voice, though it cracked with desperation. "These are lies, fabrications from a sick man's troubled mind." Thomas was clearly suffering from dementia. Was he suffering from dementia when he took these photographs? I held up a picture of Father Sullivan's signature on a bank deposit slip, clearly showing a building fund check being deposited into his personal account. Or when he recorded this conversation. I pulled out a small digital recorder that Dad had hidden in the church office. "Should I play it for everyone, Father? The one where you threatened to have him audited by the IRS if he doesn't keep quiet?" The color drained completely from Father Sullivan's face. Mrs. Henderson, whose family had struggled to donate to the roof fund, stood up with tears streaming down her face. "Father, tell me this isn't true. Tell me my children didn't go without school clothes so you could gamble in Vegas." "Mrs. Henderson," Father Sullivan started, but his voice broke. "How much?" Mr. Peterson demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "How much of my wife's life insurance money did you steal?" I consulted Dad's records. "According to these documents, your wife donated $85,000 over 5 years. The actual repairs she was told she was funding cost $12,000 total." The sound that came from Mr. Peterson was somewhere between a sob and a roar of rage. Sheriff Mackenzie, who'd been sitting in the back, stood up and started making his way toward the front of the church. Father Sullivan saw him coming and stepped back from the pulpit. "Father Sullivan, Sheriff," Mackenzie said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement, "I'm going to need you to come with me to answer some questions." "This is a house of God," Father Sullivan protested. "You can't." "This is also the scene of an apparent crime," the sheriff replied calmly. "David, I'm going to need all those documents. They're copies, I said, handing over the folder. The originals are in a safety deposit box, along with backup copies at my lawyer's office. As Sheriff Mackenzie approached, Father Sullivan made a desperate play. You're all forgetting something, he shouted. I am your spiritual shepherd. I have devoted my life to this church, to this community. One man's delusional accusations cannot. Father, the voice came from the back of the church, quiet but carrying absolute authority. Everyone turned to see Bishop Reynolds walking down the aisle, his face grave. Your Excellency, Father Sullivan stammered. I didn't know you were the diocese. Received an anonymous package 3 days ago, Bishop Reynolds said as he reached the front of the church. Bank records, photographs, audio recordings. We've been investigating quietly, but it appears that investigation is no longer quiet. He turned to address the congregation. I want everyone here to know that the Catholic Church takes these allegations with the utmost seriousness. If proven true, Father Sullivan's actions represent a betrayal not just of your trust, but of his sacred vows. Father Sullivan's legs seemed to give out, and he sank into a chair behind the pulpit. The anonymous package, I said to the bishop, was that from my father? Bishop Reynolds nodded. Dated 2 weeks ago, with a note explaining that he couldn't live with the secret anymore, but was afraid to come forward publicly. He asked that we investigate after his death. The pieces fell into place. Dad hadn't just left me the evidence, he'd already set the wheels of justice in motion. He'd found his courage in the end, even if he couldn't find it in life. Mom squeezed my hand again. He was trying to make it right, she whispered. Mrs. McKenna, Bishop Reynolds said gently, your husband showed tremendous courage in his final weeks. This must have been an agonizing secret to carry. 30 years, she said, her voice barely audible. 30 years of watching families struggle, of wondering why repairs never seemed to get done, of Tom coming home from church board meetings looking sick to his stomach. You knew, Kate asked. I suspected something was wrong, but I never imagined. Mom looked at the folder of evidence. Your father was a good man caught in an impossible situation. He thought keeping quiet protected us, protected the church, but it ate at him every day. Sheriff Mackenzie had reached Father Sullivan, who was now visibly shaking. Father, you have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rites were read in the sanctuary where Father Sullivan had preached about honesty and morality for 3 decades, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Dad's final confession hadn't been about seeking forgiveness for his sins. It had been about making sure the truth finally set everyone free. 6 months later, I stood in the same church, but everything had changed. The new priest, Father Martinez, was young, energetic, and had arrived with a mandate from the diocese to rebuild trust and community. The building fund, now properly managed by a lay committee, had already completed the roof repairs and heating system upgrades that families had been paying for decades. Father Sullivan had pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud, receiving 5 years in prison, and in order to pay full restitution, the diocese had covered the shortfall, and every family who'd donated under false pretenses received a full refund with interest. But the real healing had come from something else entirely. Tom McKenna was a complicated man, I said from the same pulpit where I'd revealed his secrets 6 months ago. This time, I was there by invitation, speaking at a memorial service for Dad's true legacy. He made a mistake that haunted him for 30 years. He stayed silent when he should have spoken up. But in the end, he found the courage to do what was right, even knowing it would cost him his reputation. The church was full again, but the atmosphere was different. People sat with their shoulders straight, their eyes clear. The shame and confusion that had clouded this community for decades had lifted. The McKenna Family Foundation, I continued, has been established with the money my father saved over the years, money he couldn't spend because it felt tainted by his complicity. It will provide interest-free loans to families facing financial hardship, ensuring that no one in Cedar Falls ever has to choose between their family's needs and their faith community again. Applause filled the sanctuary, but it wasn't for me. It was for Dad, for the man who'd found redemption in truth-telling, even after death. After the service, Mrs. Henderson approached me with tears in her eyes. David, I need you to know something. Your father helped us so many times over the years. When my husband lost his job, when our daughter needed surgery, he found ways to help without making us feel like charity cases. He never told us, I said. He made us promise not to tell anyone. He said it was between neighbors, nothing more. She dabbed at her eyes. I think he was trying to balance the scales. Even then, as people filed out of the church, Mom joined me at the front. "He'd be proud of what you did," she said. "I just read his letter, Mom. He did the hard part." "No, David. The hard part was standing up in front of everyone and telling the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. You could have let the diocese handle it quietly, let Father Sullivan just disappear. But you chose to speak up for everyone who'd been hurt." I looked around the renovated sanctuary, at the new heating vents that actually worked, at the fresh paint that had been applied by volunteers rather than paid for with stolen donations. "You know what I keep thinking about," I said. "Dad's last words to me. He said, 'Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing are different, son.' I chose easy for 30 years. Don't make my mistake." Sheriff Mackenzie approached us, hat in hand. "Mrs. McKenna, David, I wanted you to know that the investigation is officially closed. The FBI confirmed that your father's records were completely accurate. Every penny has been accounted for." "What happens now?" Mom asked. "Now the community heals," Sheriff Mackenzie said. "Your husband's courage, both of your courage. David has given this town something it hasn't had in 30 years. The truth." As we walked out of the church into the bright spring sunshine, I thought about Father Sullivan's words that day. "This is not your place to speak." He'd been wrong. It absolutely was my place to speak. It was my place to speak for the families who'd sacrificed in vain. It was my place to speak for the father who'd found courage too late to use it himself. It was my place to speak for a community that deserved leaders who served them instead of stealing from them. And most importantly, it was my place to speak because someone had to, and I was the one Dad trusted with the truth. 6 months ago, I'd thought I was exposing a scandal. Instead, I'd learned that sometimes the most sacred confessions aren't the ones whispered in darkness, but the ones spoken aloud in the light, witnessed by everyone who needed to hear them. Dad's final confession hadn't just revealed Father Sullivan's crimes, it had revealed that redemption isn't about avoiding consequences. It's about ensuring that your mistakes don't continue to hurt innocent people. And in the end, that truth had set us all free.